Hello. Today we will be continuing our discussion on Chapter 3 and going through the second part of the presentation. And so to begin with, when we talked about the neurotransmitters being released into the synapse and being picked up by the second neurons, dendrites, and the receptor sites, what we still have a question of is what happens to those neurotransmitters that aren't being picked up. And so when we're talking about the leftover neurotransmitters, there are three actions that may be taken in order to stop production or to help and make sure that there are no leftover neurotransmitters within the synapse. And so when we talk about these three actions that can be taken, the first one is reuptake. And so reuptake by the first or the original neuron that had sent those chemical messages essentially takes back up any of those leftover neurotransmitters. The second one is enzyme deactivation. And so within the enzyme deactivation, there are certain enzymes that are hanging around in the synapse, and they deactivate by destroying those neurotransmitters that are left over. And so the third and last one are these autoreceptor binders, or this autoreceptor binding. And so what happens is that these leftover neurotransmitters bind to these autoreceptors, and then those autoreceptors then signal that presynaptic or original neuron to stop releasing those neurotransmitters. And so another question to be had after talking about these leftover neurotransmitters, what's even the problem with those leftover neurotransmitters? So what's the big problem with that? And we'll actually get to that answer here in a couple of slides. So here is a great picture of these different actions that can be taken for those leftover neurotransmitters. And so here we have just a step-by-step picture of what actually happens. So here we have number one, where the presynaptic neuron right here, presynaptic neuron is releasing these bags or these vesicles full of neurotransmitters. And then here on number two, it's actually releasing the neurotransmitters into the synapse or the synaptic gap. And then number three, the postsynaptic neuron is receiving those neurotransmitters on the receptor sites. And again, remember, the receptors are located at the end of a dendrite. And so what happens are these leftover neurotransmitters that are not picked up by the second neuron are just floating around in the synapse. And so here we see number four, it may be taken up by the first or the presynaptic neuron, or it could be the second action that we talked about was enzyme deactivation. And so these certain enzymes may destroy these neurotransmitters that are just floating around in the synapse. The sixth step within this picture shows the autoreceptors. And so these are those autoreceptors that are again on the presynaptic neuron, and free floating neurotransmitters bind to the autoreceptor, and then the autoreceptor signals the presynaptic neuron to hold off on the production of these neurotransmitters. And so one thing to think about with these receptors is that these neurotransmitters and the receptors work like a lock and key. So only certain neurotransmitters fit within certain receptors. So for example, if we talked about dopamine, only dopamine receptor sites would accept dopamine. They wouldn't accept serotonin, for example. And so here again, this is just showing you an arrow that is going from the presynaptic neuron down to the postsynaptic neuron. And here we talk about the different types of neurotransmitters that we have within our bodies, and then also what is the function of those neurotransmitters. And so here we have 4 neurotransmitters. And the first one is acetylcholine, and this has to do with voluntary motor control. And one of the important things to remember about neurotransmitters is that we have to have a right balance of them. And so if we have too much, it's a problem. If we have too little, then it also becomes a problem. And so with acetylcholine, we know that the disease Alzheimer's is associated with a decrease in the neurons that create acetylcholine. And the next one that we see is dopamine. And so dopamine regulates motor behavior, motivation, pleasure, and emotional arousal. And so dopamine plays a role in drug addiction, actually, and because it's associated with this pleasure seeking. And high levels of dopamine have been associated with schizophrenia, and low levels of dopamine have been associated with Parkinson's. And so it's even been shown that patients that are taking medication for their Parkinson's symptoms, if they take too much, then they start to show symptoms of schizophrenia. And so again, here's that example or that note that I told you about. If we have too much or too little, then it does become a problem. And then the third neurotransmitter that's listed is glutamate. And so if we have too much glutamate within our system, too much glutamate overstimulates our brain and actually can cause seizures. And so this is related to GABA, where GABA, along with other inhibitory neurotransmitters, stop that firing of neurons. So GABA is used in case where the brain is overstimulated, such as if we had a excess amount of glutamate in our bodies. And so people that experience seizures or convulsions may take a GABA type of medication. And so this is also used in anxiety, where people are having maybe panic symptoms where they are just overly stimulated. And so this is a type of medication, this GABA type of medication helps to reduce the symptoms of anxiety. Here we have three more neurotransmitters. The first one is norepinephrine, and so this neurotransmitter is included in our fight or flight response. So it's involved in vigilance, where we have just these heightened states of awareness because we sense that there's danger in our environment. And so later we'll talk about an example of if we have to speak in front of class or a big crowd of people that we don't know. Maybe we see a dog running after us. It's any type of environment where we sense there may be danger. And norepinephrine paired with serotonin have also been associated with mood disorders. And so low levels of norepinephrine or serotonin are linked with depression, for example. And so then the last neurotransmitter that's listed includes endorphins. And so endorphins, we oftentimes associate that with a runner's high. And so these type of endorphins are calming and they're pleasurable, and they have similar properties to morphine. And so what we see are that drugs may increase, they interfere with, or they may mimic neurotransmitters productions or intake, reuptake. And so we'll talk about the different classes of drugs. These different classes of drugs, they include agonists and antagonists. And so agonists increase the action of this neurotransmitter, so they may increase the production of neurotransmitters. And so these include medications or drugs such as L-Dopa, which was developed to treat Parkinson's disease. And so what L-Dopa does is that it spurs surviving neurons to produce more dopamine. And so this is oftentimes what we see with this is that it helps to alleviate those symptoms of Parkinson's, but the effectiveness usually decreases with time. And so here we see Michael J. Fox, who is a well-known actor to suffer from Parkinson's disease. And then the second class of drugs and how they may increase, interfere, or mimic neurotransmitters is antagonists. And so within this specific class of drugs, antagonists block the function of neurotransmitters. So they may block those receptors from taking a reuptake or even taking in. And so there may be an overabundance of those neurotransmitters in the synapse, or there may be an overabundance of the receptors taking in a lot of those neurotransmitters. And so this may include beta blockers, which is with beta blockers, what happens is that they bind to these norepinephrine receptor sites so that norepinephrine cannot be received. And so what happens is that the heart rate slows down. And so this is prescribed for heart rate irregularities, agitation, or nervousness. And so talking about those neurotransmitters and neurons, and talking about kind of on a global scale, how do these neurons actually work together? This leads us to talking about the nervous system. And so with the nervous system, there are two main systems within the nervous system. The first one is the central nervous system, which contains or is made up of the spinal cord and the brain. And the central nervous system keeps us breathing, responds to pain, moves our muscles, and allows us to walk. And within the second system that makes up our entire nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. And the PNS for short connects the central nervous system to the body's organs and muscles. And it also houses the somatic nervous system, which we'll see here. So the somatic nervous system and is one of the special highlights of the PNS, because there is, again, as we can see on the previous graph, the peripheral nervous system breaks on down to the autonomic and the somatic nervous systems. And so the somatic nervous system is one of the two. It's like a gatekeeper for the peripheral nervous system by coordinating information that goes in and out of the central nervous system. And one example of the somatic nervous system at work includes us thinking and any type of movement that we have. So when I reach out and grab my pen, my eyes perceive it, signals travel from my brain into my muscles to coordinate me picking up the pen. Signals are then sent from my hand to my brain to signal that I have the pen and I need to tighten my grip in order to write. And so the second system within the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system, is the autonomic nervous system. And within this one, this can even be broken down further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And so with this, the autonomic nervous system has to do with bodily functions that are involuntary. And so this sympathetic nervous system, we'll talk about this one first. This kicks in when we're faced with a threatening situation, such as what we were talking about before. So if you had to get up and talk in front of a large crowd, or you see a rabid dog running after you. So when we face a threatening situation, we have this experience or this fight or flight response. So we either stand there and fight, or we flee from the situation. So what happens to our body in these situations includes elements of evolutionary theory that helps us to adapt to our environment. So the following bodily functions occur in order to keep us from harm. And so these functions that we can see on this illustration up here may include our pupils dilating so we can see better in the dark. Our heart rate increases to pump blood faster so the muscles can respond faster. We have sweat glands that we start to sweat in order to cool off our body. Digestive and immune systems quit producing antibodies. And so this happens oftentimes when we're stressed, maybe oftentimes like year after year. I notice that when finals come around and I'm really stressed, I may be more apt to getting sick. So this is related to that sympathetic nervous system. And also our hairs may stand on end and we may get goosebumps. And so this is our body's way of increasing our sensitivity to touch. So this all makes it easier for us to escape. And then lastly, this parasympathetic nervous system, this is what happens when the body is is trying to slow all of these different functions from the sympathetic nervous system. They're trying to slow them down and helps them to return the body to return to a normal resting state, because it's not healthy for us to be in this heightened state of awareness or heightened state on where we're alert all the time. And so that's where our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and helps our body to return to a normal state. So when we look at the components of the central nervous system, what we see is that within the central nervous system, this communication between the spinal cord and brain, we have these spinal reflexes. And so these are just simple pathways in the nervous system that rapidly generate muscle contractions, but they don't require the brain's input. And so one very interesting thing about the spinal reflexes is that all of these spinal reflexes that we have, they go directly to our spinal cord without having to go all the way up to the brain, and then the brain processing that information, and then going down to our spinal cord, and then down to our muscles to move away from the heat from the candle or whatever situation may be harmful. So with these spinal reflexes, they are connected from our muscles to our spinal cord. And so this is a great example of if we were to touch a flame or get close to a flame or even get close to the kitchen stove, we wouldn't want that whole process of the muscles telling our brain and the brain telling the spinal cord. We would want an automatic reflex, which we do have. And so we have these sensory neurons and these motor neurons that tell and communicate with our spinal cord. And so with this, the spinal cord and the brain collaborate for more complex tasks like thinking and moving and breathing, and more of those simple tasks that we don't even think about. These are for more of those complex tasks rather than moving our hand away from a flame. And so this again is evolutionarily adaptive for us because our body keeps us away from that harm. And so with this wraps up the second section of chapter 2.